A very good afternoon to you all, ladies and gentlemen, and happy Friday. Welcome back to Weather Center Nazario. This afternoon, and I suppose you could say early evening update, is going to specifically dabble with our newly formed and identified invest out in the Western Caribbean, as well as a very broad overview of what the tropical Atlantic looks like since we haven't touched base with it in the last couple of episodes. I'll openly admit this one is definitely going to be a little bit shorter than typically, and I'll also mention that unfortunately the main focus is going to be a bit of inconsistency that we've developed in a lot of our model platforms and ensembles with this newly identified Invest 93. Folks, I thank you tremendously for all of the viewage that I've seen on my channel over the last week now, especially the last couple of videos that I've posted. I can genuinely say I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and if you could do me the solid yet again and like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit that notification bell if you haven't done so already. With that being said, I promise today will not be as exciting. We have a lot to dig into, but we're going to keep it very abbreviated for your viewing pleasure. With that being said, let's go ahead and fasten seatbelts, get in here. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, and here we go. Despite focusing primarily on Invest 93 in our Western Caribbean AOR, as you can see, taking a look at the NHC homepage, we are still looking at a pretty cluttered Atlantic basin. We have Tropical Storm Franklin that's looking a little worse for wear, still battling that westerly wind shear, and a lot of its thunderstorm activity is displaced off to the east of its center of circulation. We'll get into that once we get over to the satellite image on my next panel. We also still have 92L. 92L has actually been hanging out in the Atlantic, particularly close to the main development region, for a little over a week now. It's still holding out there, and the NHC has slowly started to re-elevate its chances of development. There was a bit of a conflict between whether or not our interest area over the Caribbean was going to form into Idalia, or could 92L come in for the home run and steal the base, if you will, steal the name, and unfortunately it looks like 93L is going to win in this case. We also have the remnants of Emily still beginning to work its way into the northern Atlantic, likely to become post-tropical over the next 48 to 72 hours with little chance of redevelopment. And we have a new area of interest having worked its way off the African continent now into the MDR and moving west-northwest over the next couple days. We're going to switch gears here, and we're going to take a look at the large-scale sector water vapor. I love this imagery because it does a great job of highlighting all of our different circulation centers, what the big picture weather pattern looks like, as well as all the dry air that we actually have in close proximity to some of our features. As you can see here over the Western Caribbean, we have a good amount of thunderstorm activity flaring up with newly identified 93L, and unfortunately, just downstream of this feature, we do have some dry air beginning to work its way into the eastern Gulf of Mexico that may potentially inhibit a little bit of further development as we go down the line. You can also see Tropical Storm Franklin. Its center of circulation, believe it or not, if you can see my Epic Pen ink, is off in this general area, whereas you can see because of that westerly component in upper level wind shear, a lot of the main thunderstorm activity is centered over its eastern flank, dumping copious amounts of rainfall on Puerto Rico and some of the Lesser Antilles in the northern portion of the Caribbean Sea. Out to the east, we do have Invest 92L still working its way off to the northwest. Good thunderstorm activity with it as well. And we also have the remnants of Emily racing off to the north, being shredded by the jet stream activity in close proximity to it. And just off the corner of the screen, I'm going to use the yellow ink to highlight it. There is our new area of interest coming off the African continent into the MDR with a good amount of moisture to work with. So we may even see developmental chances go up with that system as we go over through the weekend and into early next week. All right, let's get into the meat potatoes, why everyone's here. This is Invest 93L. I'm still coining it Future Idalia. Some people wanted to question whether or not this would get the name. I'm still putting my money down that we're going to see Idalia come and take shape out of this. The main reason I bring us here is not necessarily for any high-resolution data just yet. Nothing has started to populate. Let's take a look at some of the ensembles because things are getting a little chaotic. So this is going to be the latest 12Z GFS ensembles. And if I go ahead and highlight the area of influence or the area of potential influence, we now have a landmass from the western tip of the Florida Panhandle all the way through the Big Bend, Tampa area into approaching southwestern Florida Peninsula that could potentially be impacted by this storm. And to include, there are so many different model intensities forecasted here. We have one projecting a potential major hurricane headed towards the Panhandle. We have a Cat 1, Cat 2 going towards the Big Bend area, very reminiscent of what we've seen with the Canadian model most recently. And then we have weaker tropical storm and tropical depression indications that could still impact parts of north and central Florida. And if you thought this was messy, folks, if you thought the GFS was being GFS, take a look at the latest Canadian ensembles. Look at that. So when I mention to folks on live streams or in certain posts on my Instagram page, which, by the way, if you haven't taken a look at it, I'll link it right up in this general area. Go ahead and check out on Instagram, WXCenter_Nazario for my Instagram page. I do a lot of nice little reel updates and post updates as well if you want to continue to get information as opposed to relaying, or I should say waiting for my YouTube videos. This here is a very, very strange conglomeration of model data, though. Now we actually have Louisiana under the gun for potential landfall. We have the coastline of Mississippi, Alabama, the Florida Panhandle, the Big Bend area still has some consistency in there, and we even have some ensemble members calling for a due east track over South Florida, wandering into the Bahamas before turning back around. So, folks, the main takeaway here is things are confusing. We're still a little ways away despite how close we are to seeing the influence of this system. And I know that was a mess, kind of a double-edged sentence just now, but all I'm saying is there is still some time to get ahead of it, get our minds and the computer models wrapped around what this system is expected to do. One fair bit of consistency is intensification, albeit whether it be gradual or fairly rapid. Once she gets over open water, these are the 18Z model intensity guidance plots. You can see we don't have all of the members fully populated yet, but if I draw a nice little average arrow, we find the mean percentile of what these models are doing. We're looking at intensification over the next couple days. So it goes without saying, Idalia is on the horizon. We may get a tropical depression over the next day or two. Tropical storm as we enter next week. All a matter of waiting. It's going to be a time-based game at this point. In regards to the rest of the tropical Atlantic basin, I wanted to pull up our NASA dust model. We haven't taken a look at this at all in recent days, and you can see that the dust is attempting to resurge and show itself over the MDR once again. We have a pretty decent plume anticipated to push its way off of the western portions of Africa in the next 72 to 96 hours, which could play a role in that new area of interest, depending on whether or not it gets organized fairly quickly and taps into what moisture and lack thereof of dust there is in place right now. But it's going to be on a time crunch again. Timing with a capital T. That area of interest is going to have to do battle with some dust, and you can see that the NASA model does kind of want to try to spin something up in that dust field. So I better use a better pen than that. Let's go yellow so you guys can see that. There is a bit of cyclonic spinach inside the NASA dust model, so this could be potential formation over the next couple days, next 5 to 7 days. Too early to tell. We'll keep an eye out, but all in all, dry air and dust out in the Atlantic is not going to be a huge variable. Not a huge variable, at least for the systems we have from this area of the Atlantic and further westward. Dry air is not going to be a big deal in terms of Saharan influence. There is some dry air out there. Let's get into some model-specific information now. I have the Atlantic Basin AOR selected here just so we can get a feel for what's out there. You can see that both Invest 93L and Franklin are battling some dry air. That dry air advection occurring over the state of Florida right now, responsible for little thunderstorm activity we've been seeing in my neck of the woods the last couple days, has been good. It's allowed surface temperatures to really amp up again once again, so that's kind of a bit of a negative. We have to take 4 showers throughout a 12-hour period whenever you venture outside of your house for about 5 to 10 seconds. At least I know. I don't know if I can speak for everybody else out there, but within the first 30 to 60 seconds, I headed out to do whatever it is I may need to do. I'm sweating. So trust me, I don't know if I want the rain or the dry air at this point. I'd rather just cooler temperatures. But as we go through time, Franklin is not going to be under the influence of this dry air. It is going to become a lot more interspersed across the portions of the Atlantic closest to the southeastern states. However, Invest 93L might have to work around absorbing some of the dry air that's just going to linger and sort of pitch a tent in the Gulf of Mexico as we see some of the wind shear begin to increase as well. That's why I don't know if you guys can see in this AOY, but it becomes very lopsided, very easterly, or I should say right side oriented as she approaches the Florida coastline. And it's these finite variables that are really going to help to deter us from coming up with a very concentrated feel for what this storm is going to do, at least for the next few days. Once we get some higher resolution model data in, we'll have a better idea of what's going to happen, but goes without saying, dry air is still an influence for some of our systems out there. You can actually see, unfortunately, 92L is pretty much wrapped up inside dry air, and dense dry air at that. You can see some very murky brown colors on both the north and south quadrants of that feature. Same thing with our other AOI off the African coast. It's going to be going right into that Saharan dust plume I showed you guys on the previous panel. GFS. That's all I have to say. GFS is doing some GFS stuff today. I take this with a grain of salt, folks. I want to see over the next 24, 36 hours if this begins to trend, but GFS is doing something very interesting. We have future cyclone Idalia. We have 93L chilling, kicking it over the Yucatan Peninsula for now. It is expected to meander and linger for at least about 12 to 18 hours, depending on when the steering pattern can finally kick back in and begin to pull her north and eventually northeast. But if you take a look at what the GFS is doing, it is now the outlier. We're looking at a potential due northward track and deepening all the way down to as low as 977 millibars. That is a solid Cat 2 hurricane, folks. Solid Cat 2 hurricane approaching the Florida Panhandle right around the Panama City, Pensacola area with an abundance of moisture wrapped up in a dry air, not posing a potential threat. Now, this does look a little concerning. I am not going to push the panic button on this, nor do I really think there is a whole lot of reality centered around this, simply because of the trends and the inconsistencies that have developed with this storm over the last 12 hours. Literally from 0 Zulu last night up until 12Z today, we've seen such a huge increase in a margin of error from all models at that point. I wish we had the European ensembles in as well. I've been taking a look at early runs on that as well. We don't have any full runs complete just yet, otherwise I'd display them, but even the Euro is becoming a bit more scattered in terms of where it wants to go. I've seen some projections still approaching the Central Florida Peninsula, making more of a Tampa landfall. Big Bend area, I've been saying it a lot. A lot of us have been saying that quite a bit the last couple days, and we're even seeing some of the same extension into the Panhandle closer to Alabama, Mississippi. So it's very strange what's happening in the environment right now, what our computer models are doing. It's actually becoming a bit more difficult to hone in on what this system wants to do as it further organizes. Take that and do with it as you please. There's still a lot of guesswork ahead of us, guys. Last but not least, before we conclude this wonderful Weather Center Nazario tropical update, I'm going to pull you into windy.com. I had a very wonderful discussion on a live stream I did on Instagram earlier today talking about steering patterns and potential future tracks based on my experience as a synoptic analyst in the Air Force not too long ago. 7 years of synoptic analysis experience. So I've seen things. I've definitely dabbled in analyzing not only for tropical features, but for good old baroclinic and jet-associated features as well. So I may not know a tremendous amount. Maybe I'm being humble, but I have a little bit that I could bring to the table. But anyways, the main takeaway here is, folks, you can see Tropical Storm Franklin is still very well organized, at least in terms of the streamlines. We have remnants of Gert still spinning off just to the west, or excuse me, the east of the Lesser Antilles. That's also another feature that's been hanging on for dear life, no longer identified by NHC, but there is still a closed low out there, albeit very, very faint and weak, not a lot associated with it. And there it is, 93L, we have a center of circulation. Now, very broad. You could almost identify two different centers of circulation in this feature right now. I'll go ahead and take you on down and zoom into the Yucatan where we're looking at it. And that's exactly why I kind of want to pay very close attention to this, because a lot of the models are very quickly transitioning off to the west-northwest and northwest towards the Yucatan Peninsula, where she is expected to interact with land and hang out for a little bit. Current satellite imagery just has this thing rocking off to the north. So if she makes that westward path, remains to be seen. We're going to have to look at real-time data as well as what our high-res models look like later on this afternoon and early evening time to get a better feel for it. But right now, things are very rocky, folks. Things are a little clouded, no pun intended. It's a little cloudy out there on the horizon. Again, maybe all the puns intended. Let's go all puns intended. We are a weather channel after all. This is Weather Center Nazario. But lots to talk about over the coming days. I'll leave you with a very, very zoomed out AOI of the Northern Hemisphere, taking a look at the big picture synoptic pattern. This is a great time to conclude. You can see this 30.28 inches of mercury, high pressure out there over central Canada. This is going to be the steering pattern for our Invest 93L as she gets closer to landfall. This is expected to advect south-southeast with an associated cold front and a trough aloft, and that's really what's going to help to pick this system up and finally get her moving. But This concludes the tropical segment. Let's go ahead and get into the wrap-up. This concludes episode 10 of Weather Center Nazario. I thank you graciously for tuning in this afternoon. As I mentioned yesterday, we are going to start amping up the content on this channel to talk not only the tropical Atlantic, but Invest 93 as she begins to organize into potential cyclone Idalia. Going forward, I think it'll be crucial that we get the high-resolution data from our new models as Invest 93 further organizes and pushes closer and closer to the Gulf of Mexico. As you saw earlier in the segment, there's a lot of inconsistencies beginning to develop between the GFS, the Canadian, the Euro, and the Icon. A few are still holding strong to a north-central Florida impact, but others are starting to wobble back and forth quite a bit, creating an even larger margin of error. So it goes without saying, folks, the biggest takeaway for today and into the weekend is a wait and see. We're on a timetable now. We're going to simply watch as she continues to move north. If she does begin to loiter around the Yucatan Peninsula, or if she perhaps stays over water, the satellite imagery is looking a little impressive and a little interesting because that center looks a little further east than the landmass with which she's supposed to interact with. But with all that being said, thank you all for tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I hope that I get to see you again soon. Thank you for checking out the channel, and thank you for your continued support, guys. This is Weather Center Nazario, signing out.